What if the person making your life a living hell was the one person who should have loved you the most? For 22-year-old Elara Vance, a struggling artist trapped in a waitress uniform. A new customer wasn't just another difficult order. He was a storm, a billionaire named Alistair Sterling, a man whose arrogance was as legendary as his fortune. Every condescending word, every impossible demand felt like a personal attack. But Elara had no idea that the cruelty in his eyes masked a secret that would shatter her world, a secret tied to a silver locket around her neck and a past her mother refused to speak of. This isn't just a story about a waitress and a billionaire. It's about a daughter and a father, separated by lies and brought together by fate in the most unlikely of places. The air in the Gilded Spoon was a familiar symphony of chaos, the clatter of cutlery against porcelain, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low hum of conversations weaving together into a single indecipherable tapestry of sound. For Elara Vance, this symphony was the soundtrack of her life's intermission. By day, she was a waitress, her artist's hands accustomed to the delicate dance of a charcoal pencil, now expertly balancing trays laden with seared scallops and Cabernet Sauvignon. By night, in her tiny, drafty apartment, those same hands would try to sketch a future she so desperately craved, a world of color and canvas, far from the sticky floors and demanding patrons of downtown Boston. She was 22, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and a resilience forged in the fires of financial hardship. Every dollar she earned was split 3 ways: rent for the apartment she shared with her chronically ill mother Sarah, a growing mountain of medical bills, and the meager remainder which she poured into art supplies that felt more like lifeblood than luxury. On a Tuesday that felt like any other, the storm arrived. He didn't walk in so much as he materialized, parting the restaurant's bustling crowd like a shark cutting through water. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car, and carried an aura of such profound impatience that the air itself seemed to thin around him. His hair was a distinguished silver at the temples, his face etched with the sharp, unforgiving lines of a man who didn't ask for the world, but simply expected it to be handed to him. This was Alistair Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Industries, a titan of finance whose face was a regular feature on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He was seated in Elara's section. Of course he was. "I need a table, by the window. Now," he said to the hostess, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. "Sir, there's a 20-minute wait for window seating, but I can—" "No," he cut her off, his voice a low, dismissive rumble. "You don't understand. I am sitting there." He pointed to a two-top that was still being cleared. The hostess, a flustered teenager named Maya, looked to Elara with panicked eyes. Elara pasted on her professional smile, a fragile armor she wore every shift. "Right this way, sir. We're just resetting it for you." As he sat, he didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. He pulled out his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen with predatory speed. Elara placed the menu on the table. He ignored it. "I'll have a black coffee. Espresso. Lavazza, if you have it. If not, don't bother. And it needs to be 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Not 189, not 191. Use a thermometer. I'll also have the steak tartare. Tell the chef no capers. I despise them. And the egg yolk had better be perfectly centered and unbroken." Elara's pen hovered over her notepad. "Of course, sir. And for your main course." He finally looked up, and his eyes, a cold, piercing blue, made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Do I look like a man with time for a main course? This is it. Be quick about it." He waved his hand, a gesture of dismissal, and his attention was once again consumed by his phone. Elara retreated to the kitchen, her composure fraying. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered to Chloe, another waitress. "Table 7, Alistair Sterling. He wants his coffee temperature checked and his egg yolk geometrically perfect." Chloe whistled. "Good luck. I heard he once tried to sue a valet for leaving a fingerprint on his steering wheel. He's a nightmare." Elara delivered the coffee, having personally stood over the barista, with the kitchen's meat thermometer feeling utterly ridiculous. He took a sip without looking up. "Possible," he grunted. It was the highest compliment she would receive from him that day. The tartare was a masterpiece of culinary anxiety. The chef, a burly man named Gus, who normally feared no one had replated it 3 times to ensure the yolk was perfectly centered. Elara carried it to the table as if it were a bomb. Sterling stared at it for a long, agonizing moment. He poked at the meat with his fork, then at the yolk, which thankfully held its shape. He took a bite. Elara held her breath. "The toast points are uneven," he said flatly, gesturing to the 4 triangular pieces of bread. "One is clearly thicker than the others. Is this the level of mediocrity the Gilded Spoon strives for?" Elara's training screamed at her to apologize, to offer to fix it, to grovel. But something else, a deeper, more weary part of her took over. "I can assure you, sir, their flavor is uniformly excellent." The corner of his mouth twitched an almost imperceptible flicker of surprise. He held her gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, a flicker of something unreadable in his cold eyes. Then he broke the stare and finished his meal in a tense, methodical silence. When he was done, he pushed the plate away, the thicker toast point left untouched in silent protest. Elara brought the bill. He placed a black credit card on the tray, the name A. Sterling embossed in silver. She ran the card and returned with the slip for him to sign. He scribbled a signature and stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. "The service was adequate." He said the word adequate, sounding like a grave insult from his lips. He strode out of the restaurant, leaving the same chill in the air as when he arrived. Elara walked over to the table to clear it, steeling herself for what she might find on the tip line. On a bill of $58, he had left exactly 0. But that wasn't the worst part. Scrawled at the bottom of the receipt in sharp, angry letters were 2 words. "Try harder." Elara stared at the note, a hot flush of anger and humiliation creeping up her neck. It wasn't just rude. It was personal. It was a dismissal of her effort, of her existence. She crumpled the receipt in her hand, the sharp corners digging into her palm. She didn't know it then, but this was not an ending. It was a declaration of war. And Alistair Sterling, for reasons he didn't even understand himself, was about to become a regular. The following Tuesday, at precisely 12:30 p.m., he returned. Elara's stomach twisted into a knot the moment she saw him walk through the door. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on her section, and then with an unnerving sense of purpose, he walked directly to the same 2-top by the window. He didn't wait for the hostess. He simply sat as if the table were his private property. "You again," he said, as Elara approached her notepad, a flimsy shield against his presence. "Let's hope for an improvement." "Welcome back to the Gilded Spoon, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice professionally level, betraying none of the dread churning within her. His orders became a ritual of torment. He would ask for obscure wines and then send them back, claiming they were corked, when Elara knew they weren't. He would complain that his soup was tepid one week and scalding the next. He quizzed her on the origin of the sea bass, the marbling of the ribeye, the specific type of basil used in the pesto, all with the condescending air of a professor trying to expose a failing student. Each visit was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He never raised his voice. His cruelty was quiet, precise, and soul-crushingly effective. He seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to find her insecurities and press down hard. One afternoon, he noticed a faint smudge of charcoal on her wrist, a remnant from her late-night sketching session. An artist, he'd sneered softly, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Let me guess, you're following your passion, a noble excuse for mediocrity in the real world. Passion doesn't pay the bills, results do. His words hit her like a physical blow, striking at the very core of her identity. How could a stranger know the exact nature of her deepest anxieties? The fear that she was just a cliché, a deluded dreamer, destined to serve tables for the rest of her life. She would go home after his visits drained and raw, the echo of his condescension ringing in her ears. She'd vent to her mother, Sarah, whose frail health confined her mostly to their small apartment. He sounds like a monster, honey. Sarah would say, her voice thin but full of warmth as she sipped her herbal tea. Don't let him get to you. People like that are just black holes of misery. But Elara couldn't shake it. There was something about him that was different from other rude customers. It felt targeted. One rainy Tuesday, about a month into his weekly campaign of torment, he ordered something that wasn't on the menu. I want the fennel and orange salad with toasted pine nuts, he stated, not looking up from a stack of documents he'd spread across the table. Elara paused. I'm sorry, sir, that isn't one of our current offerings. He finally looked at her. His blue eyes narrowed. It used to be. Years ago. This restaurant was once called La Petite Lune. They made it here. Tell your chef to make it. Sir, our kitchen is stocked for our current menu. I highly doubt we have the specific ingredients. Then find them, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. Consider it a test of your resourcefulness. I expect results, not excuses. Defeated Elara went to the kitchen. Gus, you're not going to believe this, she began. Gus the chef threw his hands up. Let me guess. Sterling wants us to source unicorn tears for his water. Close. He wants a fennel and orange salad that was on the menu of a restaurant that existed here 10 years ago. Gus swore under his breath, but then he paused, a look of recognition on his face. La Petite Lune. I remember that place. My first sous chef job. We did make a killer fennel salad. He thought for a moment. You know what, I think I have a fennel bulb in the back I was saving for a special. And there are oranges. Go tell the monster he's in luck. When Elara placed the salad in front of Alistair Sterling, his reaction was not what she expected. He didn't critique it. He didn't complain. He simply stared at it for a full minute, his power broker facade dissolving into something else. Something distant. Lost. He picked up his fork and took a bite. As he chewed, his eyes glazed over as if he were tasting a memory. He was silent for the rest of the meal. When he left, he still didn't leave a tip, but the usual insulting note was absent. For Elara, the silence was more unnerving than the criticism. That night, she described the strange encounter to her mother. He knew the restaurant used to be called La Petite Lune, Elara said, flopping onto the worn armchair. and he ordered this weirdly specific salad, fennel and orange. The teacup in Sarah's hand trembled, rattling against the saucer. The color drained from her already pale face. "Mum, are you okay?" Elara asked, sitting up straight. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah forced a weak smile, but her eyes were wide with a fear Elara had never seen before. No, I'm fine, dear. Just a little dizzy." She clutched the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Fennel and orange, that was my favorite. Your father, he used to take me there. To La Petite Lune. It was our special place." Elara froze. Her father was a forbidden topic, a ghost who haunted the edges of their lives. All her mother would ever say was that he was a passionate, ambitious boy who wasn't ready for a family. She had no name, no face, nothing but a vague, romanticized tragedy. What did he look like, Mum?" Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah's eyes darted away, refusing to meet her daughter's gaze. "It was a long time ago, Elara. It doesn't matter now." She stood up, her movements unsteady. "I need to rest." As her mother shuffled off to her bedroom, Elara stood motionless in the middle of the living room. A cold, terrifying thought beginning to form in her mind. It was impossible. A coincidence. It had to be. But for the first time, she felt that the cruelty of Alistair Sterling wasn't random at all. It was a thread pulling at a tapestry of secrets she never knew existed. And she was standing right at the center of it. The seed of suspicion, once planted, began to sprout, twisting its roots around Elara's thoughts. Every interaction with Alistair Sterling was now filtered through this new, terrifying lens. She started noticing things she'd previously dismissed. The way he held his fork with his index finger extended along the top, a peculiar habit her mother had once idly mentioned, was a quirk of her long-lost love. The way his eyes in rare, unguarded moments held a profound, almost bottomless loneliness that felt strangely familiar. She started wearing the locket. It was her most prized possession, a small silver oval tarnished with age. The front was etched with a delicate pattern of intertwined vines. Inside one side was meant for a photo, a space that had remained hauntingly empty her entire life. Her mother had given it to her on her 16th birthday, her hands trembling as she fastened the delicate chain around Elara's neck. "This was from him," Sarah had whispered, her eyes misty. "It's all I have left of him." Elara wore it now as a test, a silent question aimed at the man who tormented her. She tucked it under her uniform, but made sure the chain was visible. She wanted to see if he would notice, if he would react. For 2 weeks, nothing. He continued his ritual of quiet cruelty, his eyes never straying to her collarbone. Elara began to feel foolish, her theory collapsing under the weight of his indifference. It was just a coincidence. Her mind was playing tricks on her, trying to weave a grand drama out of the mundane misery of her job. Then came the day of the storm, a real one this time. Rain lashed against the large windows of the Gilded Spoon, the ski a bruised purple. The restaurant was less crowded, the atmosphere more intimate and subdued. Alistair Sterling sat at his usual table, staring out at the downpour, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him. He seemed different today, his usual sharp edges softened by a contemplative gloom. Elara was refilling his water when she leaned over slightly. The locket, no longer tucked away, swung free from the collar of her uniform, catching the dim light of the overhead lamp. It dangled in the space between them for a mere second. Sterling's hand, which was reaching for his glass, froze mid-air. His gaze dropped from her face to the small silver oval. Every ounce of color drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly ashen pallor. The arrogant billionaire vanished, replaced by a man seeing a ghost. His breath hitched a small, strangled sound in the quiet restaurant. "Where?" he began, his voice a raw, cracked whisper she could barely hear over the rain. "Where did you get that?" Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The reaction. It was real. "It was a gift," she said, her own voice unsteady. "From my mother." His eyes, wide and disbelieving, shot up to meet hers. They weren't cold and piercing anymore. They were filled with a chaotic storm of emotions she couldn't decipher. Shock, pain, confusion, and something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. He looked at her face, truly looked at her as if for the first time. He scanned her features, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, the stubborn set of her mouth. It was as if he was searching for something, a ghost in her living face. He abruptly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. The sound was so jarring it turned heads at nearby tables. He threw a $100 bill onto the table, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I have to go," he muttered, not to her, but to the air itself. He practically fled from the restaurant without his coat out into the driving rain. Elara stood frozen, her hand instinctively clutching the now warm locket against her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The $100 bill on the table was more than a tip. It was a surrender. A white flag from a man in full retreat. She finished her shift in a daze, her mind replaying that moment of raw, unmasked shock on his face over and over. The certainty was no longer a suspicion. It was a concrete weight in the pit of her stomach. That night, she didn't just ask her mother. She demanded. She found Sarah in the living room, reading by the dim light of a floor lamp. Elara walked over and stood in front of her, blocking the light. She held the locket out in her palm. "His name is Alistair Sterling," Elara said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and grief. "Isn't it?" Sarah looked at the locket, then up at her daughter's face, her expression crumbling. The years of carefully constructed denial, of evasions and half-truths, fell away, leaving only a raw, heart-breaking vulnerability. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and immediate. How did you?" "He's been coming into the restaurant, Mum. For weeks. He's been awful cruel. And today he saw this." Elara's voice broke. "He saw this locket, and he looked at me. He looked at me, and he knew." Sarah began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of 2 decades of secrets and sorrow flooding into the open. "I'm so sorry, Elara," she cried, reaching for her daughter's hand. "I never wanted you to meet him like this. I never wanted you to meet him at all." Elara sank to her knees in front of her mother's chair, the hard truth washing over her in a sickening wave. The monster from the restaurant, the cruel, condescending billionaire who made her feel worthless, the man who left insulting notes instead of tips. That man was her father. The small, cozy living room, usually a sanctuary of warmth and comfort, for Elara suddenly felt like a put. The air was thick with unspoken words, with 22 years of a single, monumental lie. Sarah's sobs subsided into ragged, weary breaths. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan, her gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance, as if watching a film of her own past. "Tell me everything," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. "No more secrets, Mom. I deserve to know." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze finally meeting Elara's. It was the look of a woman who had carried a heavy burden for too long and was finally ready to set it down. His name was Ali, then? She began, her voice soft and distant. Just Ali. He wasn't Alistair Sterling, the titan of industry. He was a boy from the wrong side of the tracks with a fire in his eyes that could either light up the world or burn it all down. He was studying economics on a scholarship, working 3 jobs, and he had this ferocious ambition. He was going to conquer the world, and I was foolish enough to believe I could conquer it with him. She spoke of their meeting at a college library, of late-night talks fueled by cheap coffee and big dreams. He wasn't cruel then. He was intense, passionate, and fiercely intelligent. He'd wooed her with poetry and promises of a future filled with art and adventure. He was the one who bought her the silver locket from a small antique shop, telling her it would hold their story. La Petite Lune was our place, Sarah continued, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. We'd save up for weeks to afford 1 meal there. He always made me order the fennel and orange salad. He said it was as bright and surprising as I was. Elara's heart ached. The image of the young, ambitious boy was so violently at odds with the cold, arrogant man she knew. What happened? Elara prompted gently. Sarah's smile faded. He started getting noticed. An internship at a big firm, a mentor who saw his ruthless potential. The world he wanted to conquer started opening its doors to him, and he ran through them without looking back. He became different, more focused, colder. Our late-night talks turned into him working on stock portfolios, while I sat in silence. I felt myself becoming a footnote in his grand story. Then came the inevitable. Sarah discovered she was pregnant. I was terrified, but I was also so happy. She whispered her hand, instinctively going to her stomach, as if the memory still lived there. I thought a baby would bring him back to me. To us. I told him in our favorite spot, a bench overlooking the Charles River. I imagined he'd be thrilled. She paused, taking a shaky breath. He went completely still. I'll never forget the look on his face. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even anger. It was calculation. Like I was a variable in an equation he was trying to solve. He told me a baby wasn't part of his 5-year plan. He said it would be an anchor, tying him down when he was about to set sail. The words even recounted 2 decades later were brutal. Elara felt a fresh wave of anger on her mother's behalf. He disappeared for a week, Sarah said, her voice flat. No calls, nothing. I was a wreck. Then one day a man in a suit I'd never seen before showed up at my door. A lawyer. His name was Marcus Thorne. He handed me a cashier's check for $50,000. $50,000, Elara gasped. It was an enormous sum back then. And a contract, Sarah added, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. The money was contingent on me signing a non-disclosure agreement. I was to disappear from Alistair's life, never contact him again, and never reveal the identity of my child's father. The contract stated that this was a clean break to allow him to pursue his unfettered professional ascent. The corporate sterile language was so quintessentially Alistair Sterling that it made Elara sick to her stomach. What did you do? I tore up the contract in the lawyer's face, Sarah said, a flicker of the old fire returning to her eyes. But I kept the check, not for me. For you. I put it in a trust fund that I never touched. I was so proud, so determined to prove that I didn't need his blood money. I wanted to raise you on my own terms. That money is what paid for your first year of art school, Elara, It's the only thing he ever gave you." She finally broke down again, the shame and pain of the memory overwhelming her. "I should have told you. I was just so ashamed, and I wanted to protect you. I didn't want you to know that your father was a man who tried to buy your absence." Elara wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tight as she cried. All the anger Elara felt towards her mother for keeping the secret dissolved, replaced by a profound understanding of her sacrifice. Her mother had shielded her, not just from a name, but from a devastating truth that she was the daughter of a man who saw her as a liability on a balance sheet. As she held her mother, Elara's sorrow began to crystallize into something harder, something clearer. Resolve. She now understood the cruelty in his eyes at the restaurant. It wasn't just a billionaire's arrogance. It was the deep, unsettling discomfort of a man being confronted by a past he had paid to bury. She wasn't just a waitress to him. She was a ghost, a walking, talking reminder of a choice he had made, of a life he had discarded. His torment of her was a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain control, to diminish the woman who was living proof of his own heartlessness. The fight was no longer about bad tips and insulting notes. It was about her mother's honor. It was about her own identity. Alistair Sterling wanted a clean break. He wasn't going to get one. He had started this war at her table, but she was going to end it in his world. The next morning, Elara woke with a purpose that felt like ice in her veins. She was no longer just a waitress or a struggling artist. She was Sarah Vance's daughter, and she was going to confront the man who had tried to erase them. She called the restaurant and quit. The manager, Mr. Henderson, was shocked, but Elara's voice left no room for argument. The Gilded Spoon was a chapter of her life that was now closed. Her target was Sterling Tower, a monument of glass and steel that clawed at the Boston skyline, a physical manifestation of Alistair's ambition. Dressed not in her waitress uniform, but in her best black blouse and slacks, her gallery-opening outfit, she felt like a soldier heading into battle. The lobby was an expanse of marble and hushed importance. A severe-looking receptionist sat behind a desk the size of a small car. "I'm here to see Alistair Sterling," Elara said, her voice far steadier than her hammering heart. The receptionist didn't even look up from her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but if you tell him it's about La Petite Lune, he'll see me." Elara was banking on the name being a grenade powerful enough to blow past the corporate defenses. The woman's perfectly manicured fingers paused on her keyboard. She gave Elara a dismissive once-over, then sighed and picked up her phone, murmuring into the receiver. A moment later, she looked up, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "He's not available. Mr. Thorne from the legal department will see you." "No," Elara said firmly. "I'm not here to see his lawyer. I'm here to see him." But it was too late. A tall, impeccably dressed man with graying hair and a weary expression was already striding towards her. He was older now, but Elara recognized the name instantly from her mother's story. Marcus Thorne, the man who had delivered the check. "Miss," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I'm Marcus Thorne, Mr. Sterling's general counsel. Perhaps I can assist you." "You can assist me by getting out of my way," Elara replied. Her eyes locked on the elevator bank behind him. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Thorne said, his expression hardening slightly. "Whatever your business is with Mr. Sterling, it can be addressed through the proper channels." Elara knew she had one shot. She wasn't going to get past this man with polite requests. So she did the one thing they wouldn't expect. She raised her voice. "Alistair!" she shouted, her voice ringing through the cathedral-like silence of the lobby. Heads turned. The receptionist gasped. "Alistair Sterling, you can send your lawyer, you can hide on the 50th floor, but I know who you are. Sarah Vance sent me." Security guards started moving towards her. Thorne's face was a mask of controlled panic. "Miss, you need to lower your voice. You're creating a disturbance." "Good," she yelled, her voice trembling but resolute. "He disturbed our lives. It's time I disturbed his." Just as a security guard reached for her arm, a disembodied voice crackled from Thorne's earpiece. He listened, his eyes widening slightly. He held up a hand to the guards, stopping them in their tracks. He looked at Alara, a new grudging respect in his eyes. "Fine," he sighed, gesturing towards the private elevator. "He'll see you, against my very strong advice." The elevator ride to the penthouse floor was a silent, tension-filled ascent. The doors opened directly into a vast, minimalist office that felt more like an art gallery than a workspace. 3 of the walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a godlike view of the city below. The 4th was dominated by a single, massive abstract painting in shades of black and grey. And behind a sprawling black desk sat Alistair Sterling. He looked haggard. The arrogant mask was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled exhaustion. He hadn't slept. "Leave us, Marcus," he commanded, his voice hoarse. Thorne gave Alara one last warning look before retreating, the elevator doors closing with a soft hiss, sealing them in. "What do you want?" Alistair asked, his hands steepled in front of him on the desk. "Money, is that it? After all these years, you've come for more money." The accusation was so predictable, so insulting that Alara's fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. "Money," she laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "You think this is about money? You send your lackey to offer my mother a check to disappear. You spend a month tormenting me at my job, and you think I came here for a handout." She walked closer, her footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor. She reached into her purse and pulled out an old, faded photograph, slapping it down on his pristine desk. It was a picture of a young Sarah and an even younger Alistair laughing on a park bench, the Boston skyline behind them. He looked happy, carefree, a version of himself he had probably murdered long ago. "This is what I want," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I want you to look at her face and tell me how much she was worth." 50,000. 100. What's the going rate for abandoning your child? Mr. Sterling. He flinched as if she'd struck him, his eyes fixed on the photograph. He seemed to shrink in his expensive chair. "She told me you tore up the contract," he murmured almost to himself. "She did," Alara shot back. "But you didn't know that, did you? You just assumed she took the money and ran. It was easier that way. No guilt, no consequences. Just a clean transaction." She leaned forward, placing her palms flat on his desk. "Well, the transaction isn't clean anymore. I am the consequence. And my mother is sick, Alistair. She has a heart condition, and the stress of all this isn't helping. For 22 years, she protected me from you, from this truth. She worked her fingers to the bone so she wouldn't have to touch your blood money. She is 10 times the person you will ever be." Alistair finally looked up from the photo, his eyes swimming with a turmoil she had never seen before. The cold arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a raw, naked pain. I didn't know," he stammered. "Sick, I never—" "Of course you didn't know." Alara's voice rose. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You built this glass tower as a monument to yourself, and you locked the door on anything that didn't fit into your perfect calculated life. Well, I'm here to break the glass." He stood up, looking utterly lost in the cavernous office. He walked to the window, his back to her, staring down at the city he had conquered. "What do you want from me?" he asked again. But this time the question was different. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. "I want you to know that you didn't just walk away from a problem," Elara said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You walked away from a daughter, and she's standing right behind you." He didn't turn around. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, a silhouette of power against a backdrop of his own creation, utterly and completely defeated. Elara had breached the fortress, but what lay inside was not a monster, but the ruins of a man. Alistair remained at the window for a long time, the silence in the office stretching thin and taut. The sounds of the city below distant sirens, the hum of traffic were a faint reminder of the world he usually commanded, but now seemed completely detached from. Elara stood her ground, her anger beginning to cool into a heavy, watchful stillness. Finally, he turned. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollowed-out confusion. "You have her eyes," he said, his voice raspy. "I should have seen it. I think some part of me did. That's why I kept coming back. I couldn't understand why a stranger, a waitress, could get under my skin. It's easy to get under your skin when they're your own flesh and blood," Elara retorted, though the fire in her words was banking. He sank back into his chair, looking decades older than he had an hour ago. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Marcus, in my office, now." Marcus Thorne entered the room with the cautious tread of a man walking into a minefield. He glanced from Alistair's shattered expression to Elara's defiant one. "Marcus?" Alistair began, his voice flat and devoid of its usual authority. "Tell me again. The Sarah Vance file. Exactly what happened?" Thorne stiffened. "Sir, with all due respect, perhaps this isn't the appropriate—" "Now, Marcus," Alistair commanded, a flicker of his old power returning. 22 years ago. Tell me." The lawyer sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. He looked at Elara, then at his boss. "The plan was as you instructed. I was to present Miss Vance with the settlement and the non-disclosure agreement. A clean break." "And she accepted," Alistair stated, though it now sounded like a question. Thorne hesitated. His eyes darted between them. He seemed to be having a war with his own conscience. "This is a matter of attorney-client privilege, Alistair." "To hell with privilege." Alistair slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing in the stark room. "This is my daughter." The words spoken aloud for the first time seemed to hang in the air, electric and fragile. Thorne took a deep breath, his professional mask crumbling. "She didn't accept, not at first. As your daughter said, she tore up the agreement. She was furious, proud. She said you couldn't buy her dignity." Elara watched the lawyer, a new, unexpected twist tightening in her gut. "But the check was cashed," Alistair insisted, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The bank records confirmed it." "Yes," Thorne said quietly. "It was, about a week later." He paused, steeling himself. "But there's something you don't know. Something your father made me swear never to tell you." Alistair went rigid. "My father, he was your primary mentor back then." Thorne explained, his voice low. "He was grooming you, pushing you. He saw Sarah and the baby as a threat to the empire he wanted you to build. When I reported back that she had refused the offer, he intervened. The story that unfolded was a second, deeper layer of betrayal. Alistair's father, a man as ruthless as his son would become, had visited Sarah personally. He hadn't used threats, but a far more insidious weapon, emotional manipulation. He'd told her that if she truly loved Alistair, she would let him go. He painted a picture of a brilliant future she would destroy, of a man she would forever resent her for holding back. He convinced her that cashing the check and disappearing was the most selfless act of love she could perform. And then he took it a step further. Thorne continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sarah did more than just cash the check. A month after that, she came to my office. She had a letter for you, Alistair, and she tried to give the money back. Alistair looked as if he'd been punched in the gut. What? She'd had time to think. She said she couldn't live with herself taking the money that it felt dirty. She had secured a small apartment and a job. The letter, I read it. She wrote that she didn't want anything from you, but she thought you had a right to know that you had a beautiful, healthy daughter. She even enclosed a photograph of the baby. Elara felt the air leave her lungs. Her mother had tried to reach him. She had tried to give him a chance. "Where is it?" Alistair whispered, his voice cracking. "The letter. The photograph. Your father intercepted it." Thorne confessed, the words rushing out now. He was furious. He said you couldn't afford the distraction. He burned the letter and the photo in front of me. He told me to transfer the money from your account to close the loop, and he ordered me to tell you that Sarah had simply taken the money and vanished without a word. He said it would be better for you to think she was greedy than for you to be haunted by a child you couldn't have. He thought he was protecting your ambition, protecting his investment. The truth landed in the room with the force of a physical impact. Alistair Sterling, the master of his own universe, the man who believed he had made a hard but necessary choice, was a pawn in his own father's game. He hadn't just been cruel, he had been deceived. The narrative that had shaped him for 2 decades, that the love of his life had sold their story for $50,000, was a lie. He had spent his life hardening his heart against a woman who had in fact tried to reach him, tried to give him an opening. He staggered back, gripping the edge of his desk for support. The foundation of his entire adult life. The justification for his coldness, his isolation, his relentless pursuit of success above all else had just been demolished. He looked at Elara, and for the first time she saw not a tyrant or a father, but a man drowning in a sea of regret. He had been a villain in her story, but he was also a victim in his own. "All this time," Alistair breathed the words catching in his throat. "All this time, I thought." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The anger in Elara's heart, the righteous fury that had carried her to this office, finally completely dissolved. It was replaced by a profound and aching sadness for the 3 lives that had been broken by pride, ambition, and a devastating decades-old lie. The revelation hung in the sterile air of the office, changing everything. Alistair was no longer a simple villain, but a tragic figure trapped in a cage built by his father's ambition and his own. He seemed to crumble before Elara's eyes, the weight of 22 lost years crashing down on him at once. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock it. "Cancel my meetings," he barked at his assistant through the speaker. "All of them, for the rest of the week." He looked at Elara, his expression stripped bare of all artifice. It was a look of pure, unadulterated desperation. "The hospital," he said, his voice ragged. "Where is she? Take me to her." Elara hesitated for a fraction of a second. A part of her, the wounded part that had been tormented for weeks, wanted to refuse to make him suffer a little longer. But looking at the broken man before her, she knew that revenge was a hollow victory. This was about more than just settling a score. She nodded. Boston General, Cardiac Care Unit. The ride down in the elevator was silent. The ride in his chauffeured Maybach was even quieter. Alistair stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the city. He was seeing ghosts. Elara watched him, a complex storm of emotions churning inside her. She felt pity, anger, confusion, and a strange, unwelcome flicker of empathy. They walked into the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and illness, a stark contrast to the leather and polish of his car. Alistair, in his perfect suit, looked profoundly out of place, a king in a land of the sick and suffering. When they reached the door to Sarah's room, he stopped, his hand hovering over the handle, his nerve failing him. "I can't," he whispered, his voice thick with fear. "What can I possibly say to her?" "Maybe you could start with hello," Elara said softly, pushing the door open. Sarah was sitting up in bed, propped against a stack of pillows, a book lying open in her lap. She was paler and more frail under the harsh fluorescent lights. She looked up as they entered her eyes, first finding Elara, then sliding to the man standing behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. The book slipped from her fingers, falling silently to the blanket. "Ali," she whispered the name, a ghost on her lips. Alistair took a hesitant step into the room. He looked at the woman in the hospital bed, the vibrant girl from his memories, now faded and worn by time and illness. He saw the IV drip in her arm, the heart monitor beeping a steady, fragile rhythm beside her bed. This was the reality of his clean break. Tears streamed down his face, silent and unchecked. He made a choked sound, a sob of pure, undiluted regret. "Sarah," he breathed, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." He stumbled forward and collapsed into the visitor's chair by her bed, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. All the power, all the arrogance, all the billions of dollars were meaningless. He was just a man, weeping for a past he could never get back. Sarah watched him, her own eyes filling with tears. She reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his arm. "I know, Ali," she said softly. "I know." Elara stood in the doorway, a silent witness to the reunion of two people whose lives had diverged so tragically. It was messy and painful, and decades too late. But it was real. In the days that followed, Alistair Sterling mobilized his empire for a singular purpose. He had Sarah transferred to a private suite. He flew in the best cardiac specialists from around the world. He paid for everything, brushing aside any talk of cost. But it wasn't just about money anymore. He showed up, every single day. He sat by Sarah's bed, sometimes talking for hours, filling in the silent decades, confessing his regrets, listening to her stories about raising Elara. Other times they would just sit in a comfortable silence, two people rediscovering a language they had long forgotten. His interactions with Elara were awkward and tentative. He didn't know how to be a father. He offered her things: a new apartment, a car tuition to any art school in the world. Elara politely refused them all. "I don't want your money, Alistair," she told him one afternoon in the hospital cafeteria. "I never did." "Then what do you want?" he asked, his frustration and helplessness evident. "I want my mother to get better," she said. "And after that, I don't know." Maybe I just want a father who asks about my art. The next day, he came to the hospital not with a specialist, but with a large flat portfolio. He handed it to her. Inside were the finest German-made charcoals, Japanese sketchbooks, and a set of professional-grade pastels. "Tell me about your art," he said, his voice quiet, hopeful. It was a start, a small, fragile first step on a long, uncertain road. There were no magic wands, no instant happy family. There was a mountain of pain and 22 years of absence that could never be fully erased. Sarah's prognosis was improving, but the future was still uncertain. Elara knew she might never fully forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't a single event, but a process, and theirs was just beginning. But as she sat there in the sterile hospital cafeteria, showing her father her sketches for the first time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt before. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was hope. The hope that what was broken could with time and effort be mended, and that even the most damaged roots could find a way to grow again. And so the story of Elara Vance and Alistair Sterling doesn't end with a perfect storybook reunion. It ends with a beginning, a difficult, complicated, and painfully real beginning. It's a powerful reminder that our lives are shaped not just by the choices we make, but by the truths we're told and the secrets that are kept from us. Alistair's wealth couldn't buy back a single lost moment, but his humility, born from devastating truth, opened the door for a second chance. It's a story about how the deepest wounds can sometimes come from family, but also how family can sometimes be the only place to find true healing. What do you think? Can 2 decades of pain and lies ever be truly overcome? Is forgiveness possible, or are some wounds just too deep? We'd love to read your thoughts on this incredible story in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who appreciates a story about the complexities of life and family. And most importantly, if you want more true-life dramas and compelling narratives like this one, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have coming next. Thank you for listening. What happens when a man who can buy anything tries to silence a woman who has nothing? This isn't just a story about a waitress and a billionaire. It's about the moment a dismissive, arrogant tycoon, a man used to the world bending to his will, made one simple, brutal demand of a young woman just trying to earn her living. In this country, you speak English. He expected her to crumble. He expected fear. What he got instead was a reply so shocking, so impossibly fluent in 5 different languages, that it didn't just stun him into silence, it unraveled his entire empire. Stay with us to hear the incredible true story of Elara Vance. Ethelgard's wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater of wealth on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The air itself seemed expensive, thick with the scent of white truffle vintage leather and the quiet, confident murmur of old money. For the patrons, it was a sanctuary. For the staff, it was a gilded cage where they moved like silent ghosts, their individuality scrubbed away and replaced by a crisp black uniform and an unwavering smile. Among these ghosts was Elara Vance. To the casual observer, she was just another waitress, efficient, quiet, and possessing a kind of serene grace that made her seem almost invisible, a perfect cook in Ethelgard's flawless machine. She was 24, but a weariness in her deep green eyes made her seem older. Her movements were precise, born of a discipline that seemed out of place among the clatter of silver and porcelain. Her colleague, a bubbly and perpetually stressed waitress named Chloe, often joked that Elara could carry a tray of champagne flutes through a hurricane without spilling a drop. "You're a machine, Elle," Chloe whispered one Tuesday evening as they polished wine glasses behind the service bar. "I swear you don't even breathe the same air as the rest of us mortals." Elara offered a small, sad smile. "Just focused, Chloe. You know how Marco gets." Marco, the restaurant's manager, was a man whose spine was made of jelly and whose temperament was dictated by the size of a customer's tip. He orbited the floor with a perpetual cringe, terrified of offending the titans of industry who treated Ethelgard's as their private cafeteria. And there was no titan more fearsome than Damien Blackwood. The name was spoken in hushed tones among the staff. Blackwood wasn't just rich, he was a force of nature, a corporate raider who had built Blackwood Industries from nothing into a global behemoth. He was ruthless, sharp-tongued, and notoriously impatient. He dined at Ethelgard's 3 times a week, always at table 7, a secluded corner booth that offered a commanding view of the entire room. He demanded perfection and treated the staff not as people, but as extensions of the furniture. "He's coming in tonight," Marco announced during the pre-service briefing, his voice trembling slightly. "Table 7, 8 p.m. sharp. He's hosting a potential partner from France. I want everything, and I mean everything, to be flawless. Elara, you're on his section. You're the only one I trust not to crack." A collective sigh of relief went through the other waiters. Serving Blackwood was a trial by fire. He would send back a steak if it was a single degree over medium-rare complain, if the ice in his water melted too quickly and his glare could curdle cream. Elara simply nodded. "Of course, Marco." Inside, however, a familiar knot of ice tightened in her stomach. It wasn't just Blackwood's temper that unnerved her. It was him. The sight of his face, the severe jaw, the cold, calculating blue eyes, the perfectly tailored suits that cost more than her yearly salary, was like a physical blow. Each time he walked into the restaurant, it was a ghost from a past she had fought desperately to bury. A past of unimaginable privilege and even more unimaginable pain. She had once lived in his world. She had attended galas in rooms grander than this spoken to world leaders and never once worried about the price of anything. That life had been shattered, burned to the ground by betrayal and scandal. Her family name Vance, once synonymous with philanthropy and integrity, was now a toxic whisper in the circles Blackwood frequented. Her father, Robert Vance, had been his mentor, his friend, and Damien Blackwood had been the architect of his downfall. Now here she was, Elara Vance, the heiress in exile, reduced to serving the very man who had destroyed her family, stolen their legacy, and left her with nothing but a new name and a desperate need to remain invisible. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a survivor, hiding in plain sight, and tonight she was about to serve her monster. As the clock ticked closer to 8 p.m., Elara meticulously checked table 7. The silverware was aligned with military precision. The crystal glasses were so clean, they seemed to disappear. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing down her apron. She was no longer Elara Vance, daughter of Robert Vance. Tonight, she was just a waitress. She had to be. Her survival depended on it. At precisely 8:00 p.m., the heavy oak doors of Ethelgard's swung open. Damien Blackwood strode in, not so much walking as conquering the space before him. He was a man in his late 40s, his dark hair lightly dusted with silver at the temples, radiating an aura of raw, unapologetic power. Behind him trailed a shorter, older gentleman with a kind face and impeccably styled grey hair, who looked slightly overwhelmed by Blackwood's pace. This was Monsieur Dubois, the French investor. Marco scurried forward, bowing and scraping. "Mr. Blackwood, a pleasure. Your table is ready." Blackwood didn't even glance at him, his eyes scanning the restaurant with an air of bored ownership. "Of course it is." He led his guest to table 7, settling into the booth and immediately pulling out his phone. Elara watched from the service station, her heart hammering against her ribs. Be invisible. Be a ghost. She picked up 2 leather-bound menus and a bottle of sparkling water plastered on her professional smile and approached the table. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Ethelgard's. May I offer you some water to begin?" She asked, her voice calm and even. Blackwood didn't look up from his phone. "Still. And make it quick." Monsieur Dubois, however, offered her a warm smile. "Bonsoir, pour moi de l'eau gazeuse, s'il vous plaît." "Good evening. For me, sparkling water, please." Without missing a beat, Elara replied in flawless, Parisian-accented French. "Bien sûr, monsieur. Un excellent choix." "Of course, sir. An excellent choice." She turned to fill his glass from the bottle she was holding. For the first time, Damien Blackwood looked up. His eyes, cold as a winter sky, narrowed on her. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He clearly hadn't understood the exchange and hated being on the outside of anything. Monsieur Dubois was charmed. He continued in French, "It is a delight to hear my own language spoken so beautifully. You are French?" "My family has roots there, sir," Elara replied smoothly, still in French. "I am glad to make you feel at home." Blackwood slammed his phone down on the table. The sound made Marco, hovering 10 feet away, jump. "Enough?" Blackwood's voice was a low growl that cut through the restaurant's ambiance. Heads at nearby tables turned. "I am conducting business here, in America, with an American company." He fixed his piercing gaze on Elara, his lip curling in a sneer. "You will speak English. Only English. Is that understood?" The condescension in his tone was suffocating. He didn't see a person. He saw a disobedient appliance. Monsieur Dubois looked embarrassed, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Damien, please, she was only being polite." "I don't pay for polite, Jean-Luc. I pay for service." Blackwood snapped his eyes, still locked on Elara. "So let's try this again, from the top, in English." The world seemed to slow down for Elara. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to retreat, to become invisible again. It was the safe thing to do. But something inside her, a long dormant spark of the Vance pride of the brilliant, educated woman she once was, refused to be extinguished. She looked at the face of the man who had called her father brother before stabbing him in the back, the man who had stripped her of her home, her name, her future, and he was ordering her to be small. She held his gaze. The polite, vacant waitress smile vanished, replaced by a look of cool, unreadable composure. She turned first to Monsieur Dubois and spoke in his native tongue. "Monsieur, je vous prie de m'excuser pour cette interruption. Votre confort est ma priorité." "Sir, please excuse this interruption. Your comfort is my priority." Then she shifted her posture slightly and addressed Blackwood. But the words that came out were not in English. They were in crisp, perfect Italian, her tone as sharp as shattered glass. "Signore, la sua maleducazione è pari solo alla sua ignoranza. Qui la cortesia è è la lingua universale. Sir, your rudeness is matched only by your ignorance. Here courtesy is the universal language. Blackwood's jaw went slack. He stared at her, utterly bewildered. He understood nothing but the defiant tone. Before he could react, she shifted again, her expression hardening. This time the words were in fluent, cutting Spanish. Quizás si tratara a la gente con un mínimo de respeto, no necesitaría exigirles que se rebajen a su nivel. Perhaps if you treated people with a modicum of respect, you wouldn't need to demand they stoop to your level. Monsieur Dubois' eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and dawning amusement. Marco looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Elara wasn't finished. She straightened to her full height, her voice now flowing in precise articulate German, a language known for its authority. Ein Mann von ihrer Position sollte wissen, dass wahre Macht nicht im Befehlen liegt, sondern im Verstehen. A man of your position should know that true power lies not in commanding, but in understanding. By now, a stunned silence had fallen over the surrounding tables. Everyone was staring. Damien Blackwood, the master of the universe, the man who silenced boardrooms with a single word, was being verbally dismantled by a waitress in 4 languages he couldn't comprehend. His face, usually a mask of cold control, was a canvas of pure, undiluted fury and humiliation. Finally, Elara looked him directly in the eye. She leaned in, just slightly, her voice dropping to a calm, clear, and impeccably enunciated Oxford English, the kind of English spoken in the halls of power he so desperately admired. But of course, Mr. Blackwood, you are the customer and you demand English. So in English, I shall be happy to take your order. Or would you perhaps need a few more moments to compose yourself? The sting of her final perfect English sentence was the most potent blow of all. It wasn't just a reply. It was a declaration. She hadn't just spoken. She had shown him that his world was small and hers was vast. The waitress he had tried to humiliate was in that moment entirely his superior. And in the dead silence of the opulent dining room, Damien Blackwood had no idea what to do. The silence that followed Elara's multilingual tour de force was deafening. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. Damien Blackwood's face had cycled through a spectrum of emotions. Shock, rage, and now a deeply unsettling, calculating stillness. His mask of control was back in place, but the fury behind his eyes burned hotter than ever. He had been publicly outmaneuvered, his authority shredded by an employee he wouldn't have recognized on the street a half-hour ago. Without a word, he pushed his chair back, the legs scraping violently against the marble floor. He threw his napkin onto the table. "Jean-Luc, we're leaving." Monsieur Dubois, looking both mortified and deeply impressed, began to protest. "Damien." Wait, she was remarkable. "Now." Blackwood commanded his voice, a low threat. He stalked towards the exit, not looking back. Monsieur Dubois gave Elara a final apologetic glance before hurrying after his host. The moment the doors swung shut behind them, the restaurant erupted in a flurry of whispers. Elara stood frozen by the table, her adrenaline starting to fade, replaced by a cold dread. She had won the battle, but she was certain she had just lost the war. Her job, her anonymity, her carefully constructed safe haven, it was all about to vanish. Marco rushed over his face, pale and beaded with sweat. "What have you done?" he hissed, his voice trembling with fear and anger. "Are you insane? That was Damien Blackwood. He could buy this entire city block and turn it into a parking lot just to spite us." "He was rude, Marco," Chloe said, appearing at Elara's side. a look of awe on her face. He deserved it. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Incredible. She's fired. That's what's incredible. Marco sputtered, wringing his hands. Elara, my office. Now. As Elara walked across the dining room, she could feel every eye on her. But one pair of eyes held a different quality. They belonged to an elderly gentleman sitting alone at a small table by the window. He was impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket, with kind, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He hadn't been whispering. He had been watching the entire exchange with a keen, analytical interest. As Elara passed, he met her gaze and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of approval. The gesture was so small, yet it sent a strange shiver of validation through her. Inside Marco's cramped office, the lecture was as predictable as it was frantic. He paced back and forth, ranting about profit margins, reputation, and the wrath of Damien Blackwood. I have no choice. I have to let you go. Your final paycheck will be mailed. Please just clear out your locker and leave quietly. Elara simply nodded. She had expected this. I understand, Marco. There was no point in arguing. She had known the consequences. She changed out of her uniform in the staff locker room, her hands shaking slightly. Chloe found her there. Don't worry about this, Elle. Chloe said, her voice fierce. Any restaurant in New York would kill to have you. That was legendary. You're my hero. Thanks, Chloe, Elara said, managing a weak smile. But as she walked out the back door into the cool night air, the reality of her situation hit her. She was jobless, with barely enough money for next month's rent. Blackwood now knew her face. Her invisibility was gone. What if he decided to dig deeper? What if he discovered who she really was? The fear she had kept at bay for so long came rushing back. Meanwhile, in the back of his chauffeured Maybach, Damien Blackwood was silent, staring out at the blurred city lights. The humiliation gnawed at him. It wasn't just that a waitress had defied him. It was the way she had done it, with an intellectual and cultural superiority that he couldn't buy or bully. It was a language of the world he didn't speak, and it infuriated him. He pulled out his phone and made a call not to his driver, but to his head of security, a ruthless former Mossad agent named Kael. Kael, Blackwood's voice was dangerously calm. I have a task for you. The waitress at table 7 at Ethelgard's tonight. The one with the green eyes. I want to know everything about her. Her name, her address, where she was born, what she had for breakfast this morning. Everything. And I want it on my desk by morning. He hung up. This wasn't about getting a waitress fired anymore. This was about power. He needed to understand the weapon that had been used against him. He needed to know who she was. He had a feeling, a cold premonition in the pit of his stomach, that she was more than just a waitress. And Damien Blackwood hated surprises. Back on the street outside the restaurant, Elara clutched her worn coat around her and began the long walk to the subway. As she turned the corner onto a quieter side street, a calm voice spoke from the shadows. That was an extraordinary display, Miss Vance. Elara froze her blood, turning to ice. Vance? He had used her real name. She spun around to see the elderly gentleman from the restaurant stepping out from a doorway. He had a gentle smile, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. Who are you? Elara asked, her voice tight with alarm, taking a step back. How do you know that name? My name is Alistair Finch, he said, extending a hand which she ignored. And I knew your father. Robert was one of my dearest friends. I was his lawyer and his confidant for over 20 years. Elara stared at him. her mind reeling. Alistair Finch? The name was familiar, a relic from a buried life. He was the one who had tried to fight for her father, the one who disappeared after the trial, after everything was lost. "I've been looking for you for 3 years, Elara," Alistair said, his voice soft with sympathy. "Ever since you vanished. I never believed for a second what they said about your father. And I know who was behind it all." He gestured back towards Ethelgard's, where the lights still glowed warmly. "You just served him dinner," Alistair said, his voice grim. "And tonight you did something I've been trying to do for years. You got under Damien Blackwood's skin. You made him lose control. And in doing so, you may have just given us the opening we've been waiting for." He pulled a simple white business card from his pocket. "He will come for you now. Not to fire you, but to understand you. When he does, you will be ready. Call me. It's time to stop hiding, Elara. It's time to fight back." He pressed the card into her hand and melted back into the shadows, leaving Elara standing alone on the sidewalk, the small piece of cardstock in her palm, feeling as heavy as the keys to her entire past. The sun rose over Manhattan, but Damien Blackwood hadn't slept. He sat in his penthouse office, a glass cage overlooking Central Park, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he had conquered. On the polished obsidian surface of his desk lay a single file delivered by his security chief, Kyle, an hour earlier. The file's cover was stark white, bearing a single name, Elara Vance. He had expected to find a history of a struggling immigrant, perhaps a student working her way through college. He had anticipated a simple, easily digestible story that would explain her linguistic talents and quell the burning humiliation from the night before. What he found instead was a ghost. He opened the file. The first page was a photograph, a professional headshot from 3 years ago. The young woman in the picture was smiling, her green eyes bright with a life and hope he had not seen in the tired waitress. Her name was listed as Elara Annalise Vance. Date of birth, May 12th, 2001, place of birth, New York, New York. And then the line that made the air in the room grow cold. Daughter of Robert and Eleanor Vance. Blackwood felt a jolt, as if he'd touched a live wire. Vance. It couldn't be. He read it again, his mind racing, connecting the dots with the brutal efficiency that had made him a billionaire. The hair, the eyes, the aristocratic poise she had displayed even in a waitress uniform. It was all there. It was her, the daughter of the man he had destroyed. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in the silent room. A flood of memories long suppressed rushed to the surface. He saw Robert Vance not as the disgraced felon the world remembered, but as the man he had been, brilliant kind, a titan of ethical investment and philanthropy, who had taken a young, hungry Damien Blackwood under his wing. Robert had been his mentor, his champion, the closest thing he'd ever had to a father. Business is about building. Damien. Not just acquiring. Robert used to say, his voice full of warmth, as they stood on the construction site of a new community center funded by the Vance Foundation. You build wealth, yes, but you also build communities, you build futures. That is the real legacy. Damien had admired him. He had even loved him in his own way. But admiration had curdled into envy. Robert's vision was about legacy. Damien's was about power. He saw Robert's philanthropy not as noble, but as a weakness, a diversion of funds that could be used for aggressive expansion. He saw Robert's trust as a vulnerability to be exploited. The betrayal had been a masterpiece of corporate warfare. It was slow, meticulous, and utterly devastating. Over 2 years, Blackwood had created a shadow network of shell corporations. He had siphoned small, untraceable amounts from the Vance Foundation's international accounts, rerouting them through a labyrinth of offshore entities before funneling them into a single account in the Cayman Islands, an account opened in Robert Vance's name using forged documents. The final move was to orchestrate an anonymous tip to the SEC. He had manufactured a paper trail that painted Robert as a hypocrite and a thief, a man who preached charity while secretly embezzling millions for himself. The evidence was circumstantial, but expertly crafted. Blackwood, as Robert's trusted protégé and COO, was the one who tearfully discovered the final damning piece of fabricated evidence. He played the part of the heartbroken disciple, forced to expose his fallen idol. The trial was a media circus. Robert Vance, a man renowned for his integrity, was crucified. He maintained his innocence, but the web Blackwood had woven was too intricate. He was convicted of fraud and embezzlement. His reputation was shattered, his fortune frozen, and his company, Vance Global, was left vulnerable. With the company teetering on the brink of collapse, Damian Blackwood, the hero who had uncovered the truth, stepped in. Using his own rapidly growing capital, he initiated a hostile takeover, buying up the company for pennies on the dollar. He absorbed its assets, its technology, and its charitable foundation, rebranding it all under the Blackwood Industries umbrella. He had not just defeated his mentor, he had consumed him, erasing his legacy and writing his own over it. Robert Vance died in prison less than a year later. The official cause of death, a heart attack. The world said it was a weak heart, broken by shame. Blackwood knew it was a strong heart, broken by betrayal. Robert's wife, Eleanor, had succumbed to illness shortly after, and their daughter, Elara, the brilliant young linguist who had been studying at the Sorbonne in Paris, had simply vanished. Blackwood had assumed she had taken what little money was left and disappeared broken and defeated. He had been wrong. She hadn't run. She had hidden. She had burrowed into the heart of his city, taking a menial job, living a life of anonymity, right under his nose, for 3 years. A cold, terrifying thought crept into his mind. Was it a coincidence? Had she simply ended up at his favorite restaurant by chance? Or was this something more? Was she hunting him? The defiance in her eyes last night. It wasn't just an angry waitress. It was the righteous fury of a daughter defending her father's memory. Blackwood stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The waitress was no longer a puzzle. She was a threat, a loose end from the most ruthless chapter of his life, a chapter he thought was closed forever. She was a living reminder of the one thing he feared, the truth. He had built his empire on the ruins of her family. He had taken everything from her, and now she had taken something from him, his peace of mind. He turned back to his desk, his decision made. He couldn't crush her like he would a normal business rival. That would be too noisy, too suspicious. He couldn't have her disappear. That would draw attention. No, this required a different strategy. The one Robert Vance himself had taught him long ago. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. He picked up his phone and dialed his personal assistant. Catherine, get me Ethelgard's on the line. I want to speak to the manager. No, on second thought, cancel that. He paused, a cruel, brilliant plan forming in his mind. Find the home address of the waitress from last night. The one Kyle investigated. Her name is Elara Vance. I'm going to pay her a visit. I have a job offer for her. He would bring her into his world, into his company. He would control her, watch her, and if necessary, break her completely. He would turn the ghost of Robert Vance into his own prized possession. Elara spent a sleepless night on the lumpy couch in her tiny fourth-floor walk-up apartment in Queens. The business card Alistair Finch had given her sat on the rickety coffee table, a stark white rectangle that represented either a lifeline or a trap. The name Vance, spoken aloud after so many years, still echoed in her ears. Her carefully constructed anonymity was gone. The morning brought with it the harsh reality of her situation. No job-dwindling savings, and the looming shadow of Damien Blackwood. She spent hours online researching Alistair Finch. The search results confirmed everything he'd said. He was a highly respected corporate lawyer, known for his fierce loyalty to his clients. He had defended her father with a passion that bordered on obsession, and then, after the verdict, had quietly retired from his high-profile firm, disappearing from public life. He was a man of integrity, a man her father had trusted implicitly. Finally, her hand shaking, she dialed the number on the card. Alistair answered on the first ring. "I was hoping you'd call Elara." His voice was a calm anchor in her sea of anxiety. She told him everything about losing her job, about the constant fear, about the suffocating weight of hiding for 3 years. "You were never hiding, my dear," Alistair said gently. "You were surviving. There's a difference. Your father would be so proud of the strength you've shown." Hearing those words, a dam inside her broke, and she wept for the first time in years for her father, for her mother, for the life that had been stolen from her. Alistair listened patiently. When she was finished, his tone became serious. "Blackwood's investigation will have finished by now. He knows who you are. He will not see you as a threat to be eliminated, not yet. He will see you as an unknown variable to be controlled. He will make a move, likely something bold and unexpected. He'll want you where he can see you." "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For 3 years I've been gathering evidence against him," Alistair explained. "I have financial records, sworn affidavits from former Vance Global employees he forced out. But it's all circumstantial, just like the evidence he used against your father. We are missing the final piece, the smoking gun, something from inside his inner circle, something that directly links him to the initial fraud. We need a key to his kingdom." A knock on her apartment door, loud and firm, made her jump. "Someone's at my door," she whispered frantically into the phone. "Stay calm, Elara." Alistair's voice was steady. "This is it. This is his move. Whatever he offers you, however he frames it, your answer must be yes. You need to become the key." Her heart pounded as she peered through the peephole. She didn't see a hulking security guard or a process server. She saw Damien Blackwood himself, standing in the dingy hallway of her building, looking utterly and dangerously out of place in his bespoke suit. She took a deep breath, ended the call with Alistair, and opened the door. Blackwood's eyes swept over her small apartment, taking in the peeling paint, the second-hand furniture, the stack of books on linguistics and history by her bed. It was a look of profound, arrogant pity. "Quite a fall from the Sorbonne, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice smooth as venom. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "What do you want?" Elara asked, her voice steely. She refused to let him see her fear. "I admire talent," he said, circling her living room like a predator casing a den. "And what you did last night, while wildly inappropriate for a waitress, was a remarkable display of talent. A wasted talent." He stopped in front of her, his presence seeming to suck all the oxygen from the room. "I'm a man who collects rare and valuable things. art companies, people. Your linguistic ability is a rare commodity. I have a proposition for you." Elara remained silent, her expression a mask of neutrality, just as Alistair had coached. "I am expanding Blackwood Industries into several new international markets," he continued. "Russia, China, the Middle East. It requires delicate negotiations, a deep understanding of culture and language that my current team lacks. I need a special advisor, a personal translator who can move between these worlds seamlessly. The position comes with a 6-figure salary, a corporate apartment in my own building, and access to resources you can only dream of." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. It was a golden cage, beautifully constructed and designed to imprison her. He was offering her a pale imitation of the life he had stolen from her, a life where her talents would serve his ambition. "Why me?" she asked, her voice level. A smirk played on his lips. "Let's call it a gesture of goodwill. Perhaps your father's situation was more complex than it appeared. Perhaps I feel a certain responsibility for the daughter of my former mentor." It was a lie, a manipulative twisting of the knife, and they both knew it. He was testing her, seeing if she would break, if she would accuse him. This was the moment. Alistair's words echoed in her mind. Become the key. She had to swallow her rage, her grief, her hatred, and play his game. She met his gaze, her green eyes holding his for a long moment. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You want to hire me for my language skills, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Very well. I accept your offer." Damien Blackwood smiled a cold, triumphant smile. He believed he had won. He had found the ghost that haunted him and put her on a leash, turning her into another one of his prized possessions. He had no idea that he had just willingly handed his greatest enemy the keys to his kingdom. The waitress was no longer a waitress. She was a Trojan horse, and she had just been welcomed inside the gates of Troy. The transition from a cramped queen's apartment to a sleek, minimalist corporate apartment on the 50th floor of Blackwood Tower was dizzying. One day, Elara was counting tips to make rent. The next, she was looking down on the city from a window that seemed to span the horizon. The apartment was furnished with cold, expensive taste, all chrome glass and black leather. It felt less like a home and more like a beautifully appointed prison cell. A golden cut, just as she had imagined. Her new role as special advisor and personal translator to Damien Blackwood thrust her into the very heart of his empire. Her desk was situated in an office adjoining his own penthouse suite, separated only by a pane of smart glass that he could turn from transparent to opaque at the touch of a button. She was always on display, always under his watch. The first few weeks were a relentless test. Blackwood paraded her like a new acquisition. In a video conference with German industrialists, he would gesture to her impatiently. "Elara, tell them their profit-sharing proposal is an insult, but do it in a way that sounds like a compliment." She would seamlessly translate his brutal demands into diplomatically nuanced German, smoothing over his abrasive style and often salvaging the deal. During a tense negotiation with a Russian oligarch over oil futures, she caught a subtle mistranslation by the other party's interpreter, a single word that changed the liability clause by billions of dollars. She corrected it quietly in flawless Russian, earning a rare, fleeting look of genuine surprise from Blackwood. She played her part perfectly. She was diligent, efficient, and emotionally detached. To Blackwood and his executive team, she was an enigma, a linguistic prodigy with a mysterious past utterly devoted to her work. They saw her talent, but were blind to her purpose. Every night after the long days of navigating corporate shark-infested waters, she would return to her silent apartment and report to Alistair. "He's arrogant," she told him over an encrypted line. "His entire system is built on the assumption that no one is smart enough to challenge him. The security is focused outward to stop corporate espionage from his rivals. He's not looking for a threat on the inside." "That's our advantage," Alistair's voice crackled back. "The evidence we need is a digital ledger. I call it Project Nightingale. It was a shadow accounting system your father suspected Blackwood was using even before the takeover. It would detail the initial siphoning of funds from the Vance Foundation. It's the source code of his original sin. If it still exists, it will be on his central server, likely hidden behind layers of encryption." Elara's mission was clear. She had to find Project Nightingale. She began to use her unique position to her advantage. Her job required her to have high-level clearance to access documents for translation. She started by staying late, citing the need to prepare for an upcoming meeting with Japanese investors. Under the guise of studying financial reports, she began mapping Blackwood's server architecture. She used her knowledge of languages to her advantage, exploring files in different languages that other employees would overlook. One evening, while translating a series of old internal memos from Spanish, she found a reference to a server migration project from 5 years ago, right around the time of the Vance global takeover. The project leader was Blackwood's chief technology officer, a man named Gavin Thorne. The memo mentioned a legacy data preservation protocol for a defunct philanthropic asset, the Vance Foundation. This was her first real lead. Getting to Gavin Thorne was impossible. He was intensely private and fiercely loyal to Blackwood. So Elara targeted his deputy, a junior programmer who was struggling to learn Mandarin for a new project in Shanghai. Elara, coincidentally, met him in the company cafeteria and offered to help. Over several tutoring sessions, she subtly steered the conversation towards server security and data archiving. Feigning technical ignorance, she asked him innocent-sounding questions about how one would find very old, heavily encrypted files. "The old man is paranoid," the programmer grumbled one day, frustrated with a piece of code. "He keeps the really old stuff on what we call the Ethelgard server. It's a ghost server air-gapped from the main network. You can only access it physically from the terminal in Thorne's office or, well, from the boss's personal console in the penthouse." The penthouse, the lion's den itself. An opportunity presented itself a week later. Blackwood was hosting a lavish dinner for a delegation from the United Arab Emirates. He needed Elara present to translate. The dinner would be held in the main entertaining area of his penthouse residence, 2 floors above their offices. "I'll need you on call for the entire evening," he commanded. "Stay in the penthouse study. Don't wander." As the party began, Elara was escorted to the study, a magnificent room lined with rare books. And in the corner on a massive mahogany desk sat Damien Blackwood's personal computer terminal. It was the console the programmer had mentioned. Her heart pounded. This was her chance. She had an hour, maybe 2, while Blackwood was occupied with his guests. She had a small USB drive given to her by Alistair, containing a sophisticated decryption program. She sat at the desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She bypassed the initial security layers using a password she had guessed weeks ago. Vance 98. The year Blackwood had first joined her father's company. The arrogance of it made her sick. She was in. She navigated to the ghost server, the so-called Ethelgard server, named after the very restaurant where her new life had begun. And there it was, A single file cloaked in layers of heavy encryption named simply Nightingale. She inserted the USB drive. The decryption program began its work lines of code, scrolling rapidly down the screen. The progress bar moved agonizingly slowly. 10%, 25%, 50%. Suddenly she heard voices approaching the study. Blackwood's laugh, low and commanding, echoed from the hallway. He was coming back. Panic seized her. The progress bar was at 78%. She couldn't abort the transfer now. She had to create a diversion. Thinking fast, she scanned the room. Her eyes landed on a crystal decanter of whiskey on a nearby table. She grabbed it, rushed to the door, and as Blackwood and one of his guests reached the threshold, she tripped, sending the decanter crashing to the floor. Amber liquid and shards of crystal sprayed across the expensive rug. "Oh my God! Mr. Blackwood, I am so sorry," she cried, feigning panic and clumsiness. "I was just going to get you a glass of water, and I stumbled." Blackwood looked from her to the mess on the floor, his face a mask of pure annoyance. "Clumsy girl," he snarled. "Get one of the house staff to clean this up, and get out of my sight. Go back to the office. I'll call you if I need you." "Yes, Mr. Blackwood. I'm so sorry," she stammered, backing out of the room. As he turned his attention to his guest, grumbling about the incompetence of his staff, Elara glanced back at the computer screen. 99%. 100%. Transfer complete. She pulled the USB from the port with a trembling hand, just as a cleaner was summoned. She had it. She had the smoking gun. She had walked into the lion's den and stolen his most valuable secret right under his nose. Now all she had to do was get it to Alistair before the lion realized he'd been robbed. The next 48 hours were the most agonizing of Elara's life. She sent the encrypted file to Alistair immediately using a secure drop, but she still had to go into work and face Damien Blackwood, pretending that nothing had happened. She had to sit in her glass office, translating contracts and fielding calls, while Alistair and his team of forensic accountants worked frantically to decrypt and verify the contents of the Nightingale file. Blackwood was more volatile than usual, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. He seemed to sense that something was amiss, a shift in the power dynamic he couldn't quite identify. His cold blue eyes would often rest on Elara, searching, probing, as if trying to see past the facade of the efficient employee to the enemy within. On the third day, the call came. It was a single pre-arranged text message from Alistair. "The Nightingale is singing. It's time." It was a full confession in numbers. The file contained the original untampered records of the Vance Foundation's accounts, showing the small, systematic withdrawals. It also contained a separate ledger detailing exactly where that money was moved through Blackwood's shell corporations, and finally, a log of the deposits into the forged Cayman Islands account. It was the entire roadmap of his betrayal. Alistair had already forwarded the package to trusted contacts at the Department of Justice and the Wall Street Journal. The fuse had been lit. That afternoon, Elara was summoned to Blackwood's office. The smart glass was opaque. When she entered, she found him not at his desk, but standing by the vast window looking down at the city. The atmosphere in the room was electric with tension. "The server logs from my penthouse study show an unauthorized data transfer 2 nights ago," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He didn't turn to look at her. A very large file, heavily encrypted, was copied from a partitioned ghost drive, the drive I call Ethelgard. Elara's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about that, sir." "Wouldn't you?" He turned around slowly. In his hand was a single sheet of paper. He held it up. It was a printout of the surveillance log, showing her login credentials accessing the server. "It seems your password was used, Ms. Vance." He knew. The game was over. "It was a fitting name for the server, don't you think?" she replied, her voice steady, all pretense gone. "The place where the waitress you underestimated began the end of your empire." A flicker of shock crossed his face, quickly replaced by a sneer. "You have nothing. A stolen file. It's inadmissible. My lawyers will bury you in litigation until you're old and grey." "It's not about a court case anymore, Damien," she said, using his first name for the very first time. The sound of it from her lips seemed to physically wound him. "It's about the truth. The Wall Street Journal will be publishing their front-page story in about 20 minutes. The SEC has already convened an emergency hearing. The DOJ is preparing a warrant. Your board of directors is currently in a meeting I imagine you weren't invited to." He stared at her, the color draining from his face as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He had been so focused on the legal battle, he hadn't anticipated the public evisceration. "Why?" He whispered the single word full of disbelief. "I gave you everything back. The money, the status." "You gave me a cage," Elara shot back, her voice ringing with the repressed fury of 3 years. "You offered me trinkets after you stole my family's legacy. You destroyed my father, a man who treated you like a son, all for this." She gestured at the opulent office the city below. "For a kingdom built on lies. You didn't just steal his company, you stole his name. And that is what I'm taking back." His face contorted in rage. He took a menacing step towards her. "You little—" At that exact moment, the doors to his office burst open. 2 stern-faced individuals in dark suits, followed by several uniformed officers, strode in. One of them held up a badge. "Damien Blackwood," the lead agent said, his voice booming in the silent room. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering." Blackwood looked from the agents to Elara, his expression one of utter impotent fury. The master of the universe was trapped, his power vanishing like smoke. As they placed him in handcuffs, his eyes met Elara's one last time. In them, she saw no remorse, only the cold, hard realization of defeat. She walked out of the office past the stunned faces of the executive assistants and didn't look back. She took the elevator down to the ground floor, stepped out of Blackwood Tower into the bright afternoon sun, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. The fall of Damien Blackwood was swift and spectacular. The Nightingale file was irrefutable. His empire crumbled, his assets were seized, and the truth of his betrayal was laid bare for the world to see. More importantly, the Vance name was cleared. Robert Vance was posthumously exonerated, his story rewritten from one of shame to one of tragedy and honor. Elara, with the help of Alistair, used the restored family assets not to rebuild a corporation, but to relaunch her father's true legacy, the Vance Foundation. She became its public face, its driving force. Her linguistic skills were no longer a hidden weapon, but a powerful tool for good. She traveled the world negotiating aid packages in fluent Arabic in refugee camps, securing educational grants in Mandarin in rural China, and championing human rights in Spanish at the UN. She became everything her father had hoped she would be, a builder of futures. She had taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into her greatest strength, proving that true power isn't about how loudly you can demand to be heard in one language, but how deeply you can connect with people in many. Elara Vance's story is a powerful reminder that strength isn't always loud. It can be the quiet dignity of a waitress, the hidden knowledge of a scholar, or the unyielding love of a daughter. Damian Blackwood believed his wealth made him invincible, but he forgot that true power lies in character, intelligence, and the courage to speak the truth no matter what language it's in. Elara didn't just get justice for her father. She reclaimed her own identity and turned a weapon of hate into a tool for healing across the globe. What did you think of Elara's incredible journey? Was her revenge justified? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of hidden heroes and justice served. Thank you for watching.